How long has Putin got?
I think that's what's a good conclusion of this explanations. Just I think that is the beginning of Putin's end. Reconsideration of what to Mr. Putin by people in ruling elite and also by ordinary people.
So Prigozhin, in many ways, is so important, or was so important, that he could bypass much of the Russian bureaucracy. Now, no question, there's coordination happening between the Wagner Group and Russian intelligence.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. This week, an attempted coup in Russia. Russia was on the brink of civil war, claims President Putin, after disappearing from Moscow for several days and only emerging to thank troops that stood up to the Wagner mercenary group. But those troops were really nowhere to be seen during the crisis. Putin is trying to spin his obvious weakness into strength. But who's buying that propaganda? Putin is catastrophically weakened. The Kremlin wobbles. And I speak to former Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Kasyanov, who predicts Putin is finished and soon. And on the Wagner private army, which took over a Russian city before marching towards Moscow, the Soufan group's Jason Blazakis, on what happens to Wagner now and its leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, who, by the way, has said the war was launched in Ukraine with lies about non-existent NATO threats and was really fueled by the folly of Russian defense officials seeking glory and criminal wealth in eastern Ukraine. All right, Mikhail Kasyanov is the former prime minister of Russia, and he joins us now from outside of Russia. Mikhail, first of all, just your impressions over what has been a seismic event inside Russia, an armed rebellion by the Wagner Group.
Yeah, of course, it was unpredictable in such a scale and in such a manner. And that was absolutely unique event, and that's what we see already. Just we can make a judgment that the main result is the main conclusion is that Putin's stability he kept and tried to ensure the whole population for 23 years. Putin's stability appeared to be just fragile. There is no stability, just even a military mutiny is possible. That's absolutely incredible and unexpected. That's what the conclusion. Conclusion number two is that in fact there were no people in the streets in support of President Putin. Putin claiming that he got just absolute support, like 86 or whatever % of population or voters, but no one just was on the street. We can compare and can recall just military coup in Turkey. And we remember just whether we like Erdogan or not, but thousands of people appeared in the streets just in support of his rule. In Russia, nothing of that happened. Moreover, people in Rostov-Don, which is 1 million people population, just greeted Wagner.
So I wanted to ask you, they greeted them, they took pictures with them. Why? I mean, why would they greet them so positively?
My conclusion is that Putin, first, there are two aspects on that. First, people already fed up, tired, already fatigued. Putin already just quite too much of Putin for 23 years, and it is issue number one. And secondly, people for 23 years already used to get and used to behave as Putin wanted. No consolidation, no collective action in any case. Just sit at your kitchens and just watch my television propaganda. Propaganda couldn't provide anything. During these 2 days, they were shocked. They didn't know what to do. That's why just its conclusion, the main conclusion is this, that Putin demonstrated weakness of himself, or just his authority was undermined considerably, and weakness of the whole system, of Putin's system. State institutions don't work, but some kind friendly groups, military friendly groups, could have a dispute, could have a fight just among themselves. That was already just beginning of general, I would say, collapse of the regime. And people already watching this. And the most important that people in inner circle, just people working on different levels of governments, in federal government and regional governments, they understand that Putin not anymore just moderator or protector of their interests. They're simply weak, just weak leader who now just looked more like fanatic rather than just solid and I would say successful leader.
You worked in the Kremlin. You spent your life in Russia. What happens in a system as brutal as the Russian system can be to somebody who appears weak? What happens to them?
I think that's the most important thing. Nothing will happen tomorrow or day after, but the general attitude to Mr. Putin, people will start reconsidering the attitude. As I said, the most important that is the people working in the governments, on different level of governments, regional and federal. They will just reconsider this, and they will not implement just some kind of strong order if it's necessary for Putin to issue, as he did yesterday. He already demonstrated what could be. The main tool of operating Mr. Putin ruling the country, this FSB. People live in Russia just because of the fear that FSB controls everything. It's Putin's main instrument, and just everyone could be punished tomorrow for non-loyal behavior to Putin. And what happened yesterday. In the morning, Putin made a very strong statement that all these traitors should be arrested and punished. And just FSB issued a criminal case and started just trying to arrest Prigozhin. In the evening, Putin canceled all of this. FSB, it's not just I would say a simple tool. FSB, it's not some kind of puppet. That is corporation. That's not authoritarian organization. That's corporation, and Putin is part of this corporation. And now they will never forget this. And I think they will not forgive him such a behavior and attitude to corporation. And that's what the most important thing. I think just the cracks already started to appear and a major tool of Putin's rule.
Is it naive to think that Prigozhin was acting alone and that he stood up and moved into Rostov-on-Don and then further towards Moscow without help from some military leaders, mid-ranking military, and possibly from the FSB itself? Because this is an organization that operates all over the world. A lot of people think it's in sort of a shadow and a cushion for Russian authorities to operate, not in name, but under the Wagner name. Did he have some? Do you think that this was a larger conspiracy?
No, that's not, absolutely not. Because of the simple reason, Prigozhin was a friend of Putin, just his assistant, whatever, just cook, chef, whatever, assistant and many things. And he also was a tool in his hands, just working in Africa and this Wagner group and just achieving some kind of goals Putin wanted to get, and Libya too, and many other countries, and here in the war against Ukraine too. That's why he appeared there in Russia. It is illegal to have such an organization under Russian laws. It is illegal. And Prigozhin and Putin know very well that just the Wagner existence in Russia, it's illegal activity. That's issue number one. Issue number two, Prigozhin doesn't want to change. He doesn't want to change Putin. Doesn't want just to change authority. He wanted money. He was promised good money and didn't wait it for a long time and didn't get it. And that's why he was so angry. And he raised the stakes in this game. And he played too high and too rash. Mr. Putin doesn't forgive such a play against him. Of course, right now, Prigozhin could be seen as a winner of this because he got what he wanted, just maybe a truck of money, of cash black cash and just left Russia, but and without any arrest, etc. But I think in the nearest future we will see that Prigozhin will be punished. In which way, I don't know. Maybe even simply liquidated, because Putin will never forgive such a behavior. Of course, he understands just different friendly groups in the power and legal, like just all agencies, illegal agencies with the arms in hands, and illegal like Prigozhin, they could somehow fight, and that was one of the way for Putin just to divide and rule. But Prigozhin overplayed, and that's what for that he will be punished, and Putin will not forgive. But Putin already got just undermined reputation, and of course he is being seen right now by many as a weak leader and not really a system is not really strong.
You say that Putin will punish Prigozhin, maybe liquidate him, but where was Putin? I mean, it took him like 14 hours even to come up and appear on television while this was going on. Then his presidential plane took off towards St. Petersburg and disappeared off radars. He hasn't popped up. It is now, as we're doing this interview, it's now Monday. We still haven't heard from President Putin anywhere. None of the Kremlin inner circle have said anything. Shoigu showed up in a few photographs, supposedly on the front line of Ukraine. I mean, this looks like the Kremlin leadership with Putin at the tip of the spear is completely absent.
Yeah, it doesn't. Their disappearance and not appearing right now and giving explanation, it doesn't surprise me much. And even look on Friday and Saturday, we see just Minister of Defense didn't inform anything, just on this column, just moving just to Rostov and then Voronezh, and then to Moscow. No information. The propaganda, the central television propaganda, just was shocked. They kept silence. They didn't know what to say because they had no instructions. The system works on an instruction basis. There were no instructions. Putin didn't know what to do. He wanted to stop this, but he couldn't. But he couldn't do this until he found just the instrument of negotiating with Prigozhin, who is a friend of Putin and friend of Prigozhin. That is Mr. Dumin, now governor of Tula region, but before he was a general in a general staff on the Ministry of Defense, and before that he was a personal bodyguard of Mr. Putin.
Right. This guy was Putin's personal bodyguard, and rumors are he could even be replacing Shoigu as the defense minister.
And this guy just negotiated with Prigozhin all this deal. He negotiated. Not Lukashenko. Lukashenko was frontman, just and the guarantor that Prigozhin could come to Belarus, and that's it looks the whole event looks like just a dispute between just two bandits, and finally just resolved in this way. No single state institution was involved in settling this problem. Just different groups just settled and discussed and settled their interests in their own way. And now just population doesn't know what happened. Of course, Putin will appear, if not today, maybe tomorrow, will give some kind of strange explanation so people could eat something. But the situation is such. The state authority was on the side, and some other people, we don't know who those people are, including Lukashenko, settled the problem of existence of a Russian state. I don't say the Russian country, Russian state as a set of institutions. Those institutions was completely locked, didn't play any role. That is the main conclusion. Just Putin's Russia doesn't work properly or doesn't work at all. It's simply imitation of strong state. Country lives with the state institutions without activity. They don't work.
What happens to other people now watching this, people who hold power in Russia, like governors, for instance, who up until now, as you mentioned earlier in the interview, always feared the FSB. Speak out, you can be arrested. Act without Kremlin approval, you can go to jail or have your assets taken away from you. Suddenly, all of that looks pretty weak. So is this just the first of many challenges now, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And we could also note that during this period, just not all governors publicly demonstrated their loyalty to Mr. Putin. Some of them just kept silence. It means they didn't know what to do. They have no real, just I would say, wish to be on strong support of Mr. Putin. And as expected, the most loyal governors didn't demonstrate their loyalty. That's again a demonstration. We just already mentioned just ordinary people, but no one from the I would say the ministries. No, there was no statement of prime minister. There was no statement of Minister of Defense. There was no statement of FSB director, and there was no statement of Russian guards. And that's what's the demonstration. Just the 25,000 people troops going to Moscow, and there is no information. People don't know what's going on in their country. 2 million, two cities with the population of 1 million surrendered in 10 minutes. No single attempt to fight, to protect people. People were shocked on that. Yeah.
How long has Putin got?
I think that's what's a good conclusion of these explanations. Just I think that is the beginning of Putin's end. We expected, and I mentioned to you previous interviews, that I would say great success of Ukrainian counteroffensive would trigger just the beginning of the end of Putin's regime. But Prigozhin just appeared to be ahead of this. I think he's on that event. This is mutiny, whatever, just rebellion, what we saw. That's already just beginning. That's triggered just the full reconsideration of to Mr. Putin by people in ruling elite and also by ordinary people. I think the attitude to Putin will change, and attitude to war against Ukraine will change, and that's what we'll see. Just we're expecting success of Ukrainian counteroffensive, which will cultivate just further on all this boiling inside Russia now.
Could you comment on two main points that Prigozhin made in a video as he was mounting this rebellion? One, that the very premise for the war, that NATO was about to attack Russia or Ukraine was about to attack Russia, is false, and it was a lie by the authorities and by namely by Shoigu, the defense minister. And the second point, that he says the front lines of Russian troops are collapsing along the Zaporizhia Kherson axis, as he called it, that 1,000 soldiers, Russian soldiers, may be dying a day.
Yeah, that is of course a very direct and open statements of him. It was structured in a way that there was not Putin responsible for that. That Putin was misinformed on all of this by Shoigu and others. Just he blamed them for just misleading Putin, and Putin made this just mistake or whatever, a wrong decision or something like that. That's some kind of imitation. He was already on an emotional way to Moscow to press Shoigu so that the military supply of ammunition and whatever other things would take place, that money would flow appropriately. He wanted to be independent. He denied proposal to join to sign contract with the regular army, so to get official status. No, he wanted to be independent, but he wanted to get just money, to have independency, to have influence as a military just unit, but to be independent from any state organization. That was just overplaying. And Putin said yesterday, this ambition just was already beyond imagination. Yeah, that's what he overplayed. But that's reality. That's what we have right now.
What happens to Wagner now? Do you think that this idea, and by the way, the details of the deal, we've only heard it from Dmitry Peskov, the main spokesman of the Kremlin, who is notoriously a little loose on facts and information, to say the least. So nobody really knows what that deal is. So the idea that Wagner is now going to be incorporated into the regular Ministry of Defense Russian troops, or that some of them are going to wind up in Belarus, nobody knows what's going to happen. Do you think this organization continues, or is it the end of it? And what is your conclusion either way in terms of its threat still to the state?
I think there is no any more threat to the state, but the future of Wagner is potentially clear. Just first, we should know that Prigozhin was not the founder of Wagner. Prigozhin joined Wagner at a later stage. Wagner existed before. Wagner was founded by former officers of GRU, Special Forces Operation Forces units. And they were not satisfied by simple life in Russia, and that's why just decided just to continue their military way understanding of life. They created this group just to make money in different countries, like South Africa, few of those countries. And I think just part of this Wagner, or basic part of Wagner, will continue to work this way. They go on to Belarus and then go to South Africa, just cooperating with the governments of African countries and being paid just successfully by that, and they will enjoy their life. That's their job, to have gun in the hands every day.
And money in their pockets. And money in their pockets.
Yeah, and money in their pocket, exactly. Other people who joined recently, if they wish to be military, they will join regular army, will sign contracts and will go there. Just few will disappear and just go back to homes, something like that. That the issue is, the main question is, what will be with Prigozhin? That's what I'm saying. I could be wrong, but I know Putin a bit, that Putin will not forgive this overplaying of this pressure, public pressure. This is humiliation. Putin never had it for 23 years in rule. He never has this. And these friends allowed himself to humiliate Putin in such a tough manner that will not be forgiven. That's why Prigozhin will face with problem in the upcoming future.
Last question to you, Mikhail, and I appreciate your time. What would you say is the fallout in terms of how this will affect the front line, how this will affect the war in Ukraine?
I think they will affect, not visibly tomorrow, day after, but of course the moral state of Russian military is very low. And having this and watching this and having rumors, but there will be a lot of rumors, just how it was done, etc., etc., etc. Of course, they would undermine just their, I wouldn't say ability, they would undermine their, not wish, but just actual capability and desire to be on the front line. That's why I think the discipline would be even lower, and that will create, I would say, additional opportunity for Ukrainian army to counteroffense. I think that's inevitable, just because they understand that the leader is not quite the leader as they thought before, and those sayings of Prigozhin you mentioned of just there was no reason to start the war or something like that. Of course, they will be discussed widely, and that's why I think diluting of strong defense system also appears.
And you believe that the West should take advantage of this as well in terms of helping Ukraine in a more rapid manner with weapons that it's asking for, like ATACMS and F-16s, etc.
The West should continue to support Ukraine as they promised, as much as they needed, as G7 made several times by individual statements or just as a G7 group. Absolutely clear that Ukraine defending everyone, the whole international order existing right now. Of course, that's absolutely crucial thing to do this, to support Ukraine.
Mikhail Kasyanov, the former prime minister of Russia. Always a great pleasure to talk to you, Mikhail. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
Jason Blazakis is a senior fellow researcher at the Soufan Center, and he, along with several others, have just authored a special report on Wagner called The Evolution of a Private Army. Jason, look, there's so many things I want to talk to you about Wagner, but first of all, you told me that you've been studying them for a very long time. Just what are your impressions about what's happened in the last 3 or 4 days inside Russia and with Yevgeny Prigozhin? It is startling stuff.
It certainly is. I started looking at the Wagner Group even when I was still in the U.S. government, long before I actually joined the Soufan Center as a senior research fellow. And at my time at the State Department, I was in the Counterterrorism Bureau. Being in part of the Foreign Ministry, you have to be well informed about various affairs happening overseas. And it was in 2014 I first got a glimpse of what the so-called Wagner Group was, when it was part of the invasion force that the Russian Federation used to annex Ukraine. So starting from that point to where we sit now, to the culmination of the Soufan Center report that was just released, the organization known as the Wagner Group, led by an individual by the name of Yevgeny Prigozhin, has had a lot of ups and downs. And obviously over the course of this weekend, where we saw Prigozhin and a number of senior Wagner members and members of the Wagner organization take over a southern city and a military command within a southern city, and then start a foray towards Moscow after fighting in Ukraine and doing all the things they did in between, which I'd be happy to talk about as well. It was really quite something else. This was an individual, Prigozhin, who had a very strong and tight relationship with Vladimir Putin. And now when Putin talks about what happened over the course of the weekend, he won't even mention Prigozhin by name, which is something he does with individuals who have fled the Russian Federation or otherwise crossed him. Individuals who, for instance, were former intelligence officers who defected to the Russian Federation. He never talks about those individuals by name. His political opponents, who he feels threatened by, like Alexei Navalny, he never responds to him by name. He just says the individual, and that's the audience now that Prigozhin has joined.
Right. First of all, your report says evolution of a private army. Surely this isn't a private army in the classic sense. I mean, they operate with the blessing of the Kremlin and with the security service, I assume. And President Putin said today, when he was speaking to soldiers and thanking them for stopping a civil war, that the Russian government has given these guys, Prigozhin and Wagner, over $1 billion.
So this is an organization in its early days you could characterize as a private mercenary company that was really an organization that did advantage itself of plausible deniability. But over time, it became very clear, especially in September of 2022, when Yevgeny Prigozhin said he was the leader of the Wagner Group, that this aura of plausible deniability completely evaporated. And even before then, it was pretty well known that the Wagner Group was a tool of the Russian Federation. And like pursuant to Russian law...
So can I just stop you there?
Yeah, go ahead.
Plausible deniability. So it's run by the Russian government. They send them out to do things that they don't want to admit that the Russian government is doing, like?
Such as reaping the benefit of the natural resource exploitation that the Wagner Group is engaged in. Places like Africa, where the Wagner Group has essentially entered into commercial relationships with a government where they provide security services in exchange for access to natural resources, and those natural resources inevitably end up back in the coffers of the Russian government. And no doubt Prigozhin is taking his cut, right? He has to pay for his mercenaries. But it is an entity that absolutely has benefited the Russian Federation, both militarily and, very importantly, economically, and in terms of propaganda value as well.
So all the more reason that in an organization that is funded by the Russian government, receives the personal blessing of President Putin, no doubt operates on a leash, I would say, and let me ask you this, does it operate on a leash from the SVR or the FSB. It answers surely to the Russian security services, and because of that is an extension of the Russian intelligence services.
So Prigozhin, in many ways, is so important, or was so important, that he could bypass much of the Russian bureaucracy. Now, no question, there's coordination happening between the Wagner Group and Russian intelligence. Russian former intelligence operatives and special force members are who precisely is part of the Wagner Group. These are individuals that have very strong ties to the Russian military and intelligence apparatus. But what made Prigozhin special was his ability to directly deal with Putin. And who had the leash on Prigozhin was Putin, or so Putin thought until we saw this weekend.
So I can't help but think an organization and its leader, which answers to Russian special services or works with special services, must have had the blessing, and this is a big leap, but must have had the blessing of the Russian special services or intelligence services to take over Rostov-on-the-Don, the city in the south, take over the defense ministry headquarters, and then start moving towards Moscow. Because otherwise, why would Prigozhin ever think that he could succeed?
There may have been promises made to Prigozhin, and he could have been, frankly, fooled. He could have believed certain promises made to him. That's certainly one possibility that individuals made to him as a promise that, we will support you if you move forward. They provide, access to Rostov-on-Don. That was easy. No shots were fired, and then making a slow way towards Moscow, where there, was more interaction with Russian military, but it was far too easy. And there could be a number of reasons, that reason could be that he had certain promises and people didn't, cash in on that promise. And he was fooled. The second could be, Russia is a very corrupt place. A lot of individuals may just, have decided that they don't want to necessarily get in a firefight with the Wagner Group and die for Putin. In the end, it's very peculiar that Prigozhin decided not to continue to press forward because he had a lot of momentum. Would he have succeeded? Probably not. He pretty got himself killed. But nonetheless, he is almost inexplicable what he did in the end. Just say that the protest was over, as he called it, right?
But I mean, there's a lot of contradictions here, right? Because on one hand, you say, President Lukashenko of Belarus came out today and said in his negotiations with Prigozhin that, he told him you're going to be squashed like a bug. I mean, you got to turn around. And President Putin said, of course, our forces would prevail. But then he turns around in the next breath and says, when thanking the military, the military, which really never, in big numbers or any numbers that I saw on the ground in anything notable, blocked Prigozhin. Putin turned around and said, without you, we would have had a civil war. I mean, we were on the brink of a civil war. So which is it? I mean, Prigozhin and Wagner represented a huge threat to the state, and it was going to erupt in massive, bloodshed and gunfire in the streets of the capital and around Red Square, or they were just going to be squashed as bugs anyway. So they were never really a threat. But thanks Army and Air Force for trying your best to stop them, if you really did.
Russia is always, to me, a country of contradictions, and the propaganda come out of the Kremlin is often doublespeak. So the idea that there these competing narratives of there could have been a civil war and bloodshed would have spilled on the motherland, but at the same time we would have quashed you. This kind of doublespeak is unfortunately very common within the Russian Federation. Communication often is very confusing when it comes out of the Kremlin. In the case of the Wagner Group and its activities over the course of the weekend, we can't deny the fact that the Wagner Group has tens of thousands of individuals who comprise it. Can't deny that the Wagner Group was comprised of individuals that had very serious backgrounds in Russian special forces or intelligence, and that they would have been a force to have reckoned with. Would they have won? Probably unlikely, but nonetheless, we have to keep in mind a lot of the Russian conventional forces and some of their best military assets are in Ukraine, not in Russia.
And a lot of them sympathize with Wagner and sympathize with Prigozhin because they feel that they were being fed into a meat grinder, and that Wagner had much better command structure and was much more successful in the battlefield than the Ministry of Defense and the classic Russian army under the defense minister Shoigu.
Absolutely. Shoigu, Gerasimov were common targets of Prigozhin's vitriol. And the Wagner Group had more successes when they focused on specific areas like Bakhmut than the Russian conventional military forces. And this is a source of consternation, obviously, that existed between Prigozhin, Shoigu, and Gerasimov. This idea somehow that he was spilling his blood for the motherland, while the corrupt venal leaders of the Russian military establishment, were sitting comfortably in their offices. Prigozhin liked to portray an image of being on the front line, of course, but not only that, individuals owe fealty to him. Just like when ISIS carries out prison breaks and essentially get new jihadists to join the fold, those jihadists feel loyal to ISIS, right? And the same thing really has happened with the Wagner Group as well. Prigozhin went to the prisons, as we know, in Russia, released individuals who were going to spend their lives in dire circumstances in Russian penal colonies, and he's the one that got them out. They have some loyalty to this guy. He paid them. He got them out of jail. A lot of them willing to die for him, but they didn't want to die for him in the way that they were dying. And this perception was that they were dying because they were being used as cannon fodder because the Russian military establishment was corrupt.
Tell me, first of all, when we talk about Wagner or Wagner'S, as you pronounce it in Russian, is there anything to admire about this group when you look at the totality of what they have done in places like Mali and elsewhere? How would you characterize what they really are?
I have written both for the LA Times, U.S. News and World Report that this is an organization that, while it seizes the label of being a private military company, I think it's more along the lines of a terrorist group carrying out politically premeditated acts of violence, and it should be treated as a terrorist organization. Now, the United States government labeled a few months ago the Wagner Group a transnational criminal organization, and it certainly is that too. But these things aren't always mutually exclusive. It can be both a criminal organization and an organization that's engaged in terrorism, and I think that's a better way to describe the Wagner Group.
Why are these definitions important?
These definitions are particularly important because it can allow for governments to use tools in their arsenal to counter organizations that are terrorist groups in different ways than criminal groups. And just one very quick example is that in the United States, when a group is labeled a foreign terrorist organization pursuant to U.S. law by the Department of State, it allows for the Department of Justice to provide essentially more prosecutorial leverage, not only to attorneys who may want to prosecute individuals who try to provide support to the Wagner Group, but it also could lead to individuals who provide that support behind bars for a longer period of time than, say, if they were a run-of-the-mill criminal organization or sanctioned for some other kind of violation pursuant to U.S. law. For instance, there are an array of sanctions that the U.S. government has placed against the Wagner Group, labeling it essentially an organization that causes instability in Ukraine. That's one thing. But it also, if you label it as a terrorist group, it may change the calculations of individual countries that want to do business with it. It could lead to risk calculations that may essentially lead to de-risking relationships that maybe the Wagner has with a country like the Central African Republic or with Mali, as an example. So it's a really important tool that has significant symbolic and normative value, but also has real teeth.
What happens to Wagner now? What do you think? Do they retreat to Belarus, and Yevgeny Prigozhin just uses them as a company that operates out of Africa and dips into diamond mines and some of the things it was doing, or do you think they're going to regroup and even a member of the Russian Duma has said, they're such an effective fighting force. Never mind what its leader has done, but we have to continue to support Wagner.
So I think the blueprint exists. The Russians have seen very clearly that the Wagner Group, as a PMC and what it eventually would become a transnational organization or a terrorist organization, is an effective tool of foreign policy and military policy for the Kremlin. And since the beginning of the 2014 creation of the Wagner Group, there have been other Russian private military companies formed since. Even Gazprom, the Russian gas entity, has its own private military company. Even the space agency has the so-called Uran for Uranus private military company. The space agency, they see that there's value in this. And absolutely, Wagner has created the template for the Russian Federation to emulate again, but perhaps they can be more effective doing it by having perhaps less of a wild card at the head of that organization. Because Prigozhin, he was a wild card. He was an individual with a really checkered background, an individual who has a criminal past, rose up, became exceedingly rich, but became uncontrollable. The future of the Wagner Group, I think, is yet to be written. I don't know what the final chapter is. There are a number of avenues that could happen. I think the most likely, though, is that Prigozhin's going to be confined in exile in Belarus. If he survives more than a few years, I'll be surprised, because Putin has a long memory, and no question, Prigozhin crossed a line with Putin. What happens to Prigozhin's assets overseas? I wouldn't be surprised if the Russian Federation subsumes them and uses them for their own benefactor. And for their own benefit. And by this, I mean, essentially, perhaps putting other so-called mercenaries in charge of the assets Wagner has overseas. I think it's going to be very difficult for Prigozhin to leverage those assets from Belarus. I think the Putin regime is going to stop that from happening.
But there are still some 25,000 fighters. We don't really know. There could be as many as 50,000, according to some of the estimates a few months ago. So what happens to these guys? If they refuse to go into the Russian army, which some of them no doubt will do, some of them may return home, but there's still a big fighting force that's going to wind up at some of these abandoned army bases that Lukashenko is turning over in Belarus to them.
Absolutely. So the notion that you would have very well-armed mercenaries without any direction running around the continent of Africa in places like Mali and the Central African Republic, where the group and its membership have carried out gross human rights abuses, is very worrisome. So from my perspective, this is something the United Nations, the West need to engage with countries in which are hosting currently the Wagner Group to essentially evict those individuals as quickly as possible, because without that leadership, without any direction, real deal for and fear for the people in those countries, the kinds of abuses that they could face. Now, in the scores of individuals, the thousands and thousands of individuals, I think the Russian Federation is going to make an effort to bring those individuals into the military fold, and those that don't comply, will have a Russian form of justice meted upon them. The idea, I think, that Putin said, or the spokesperson for the Kremlin said, that if they don't want to fight, they can go home to their families. I don't believe that for one moment. There's a war happening. Russia has lost a lot of face recently. They're going to need to deploy those assets effectively in Ukraine if they're going to be able to win the day there. And it's not looking good.
And it's interesting that you say, and you note accurately, that it's just not the Wagner Group that exists, but there are other of these private army for hire groups within Russia that the Kremlin's been feeding and funding. Would you not, like everybody outside the country, say, that's a dangerous thing to do, because you let the dog off the leash and he may turn around and bite you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Putin probably has a lot of regrets about the level of autonomy that he may have provided Prigozhin, because we've seen increasingly erratic behavior from Prigozhin in terms of his rhetoric, directing his vitriol at Shoigu and Gerasimov. The propaganda that he was pushing forward in terms of showing dead Wagner members behind him and blaming the Russian Federation for their deaths. That's not a good propaganda look for the Russian Federation. I think they're going to think very deeply about who's in control of any quasi-private entities in the future. And there's certainly going to be individuals, I think, that they could identify who lead future private military companies that won't be as reckless or as a danger to the Russian Federation's stability as Prigozhin.
Is there any final point you would make in terms of your report on what the U.S. and other Western countries should be doing to combat this group, other than just the classification beyond a criminal group to a terrorist organization? Is there anything else you think that they should do to meet these private militias head on?
One very important thing that's emphasized is to really shine a bright light on the organization's human rights abuses and help any entity that's investigating those atrocities, providing evidence so individuals can be successfully prosecuted for their horrific acts of terrorism and human rights abuses that the group has perpetrated time and again against people across the globe in places like Ukraine, Mali, the Central African Republic. We really do have to think about the civilians that have been harmed by this group in the end, and that there is appropriate justice for those that have carried out those atrocities.
Jason Blazakis at the Soufan Center. Thank you so much, Jason. It's always good to talk to you.
My pleasure. Great seeing you.
And that's our backstory this week. All of our interviews, by the way, are also in video form on YouTube. You just search Dana Lewis YouTube and you can watch them. A civil war averted in Russia? Really? I think Putin appears weak and remote, and he let the so-called coup plotters, who he says stabbed the state in the back, off the hook, dropping all charges. Is that a show of strength? As we speak, the war in Ukraine rages. It is destabilizing Putin and his regime in Moscow, and the losses on the battlefield seem to chip away at the foundations of Putin's rule, mounting daily. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening to Backstory, and I'll talk to you again soon.